Hey, I'm Wes, the Explosion, and I saw a short where someone was going around a convention asking people what the worst Nintendo console was, and while a lot of the answers made sense, some of them seemed more contrarian. But I'm the sort who doesn't like dismissing the opinions of others out of hand, so I found myself thinking for a while about why someone would hate a certain system that seems pretty unobjectionable, and began to wonder, could I come up with a reason for each one as to why someone might despise it above all others? Let's find out. A few special notes: I'll be dividing things up by home console, handheld, then oddballs in order of release, and when it comes to different models, if they have the same cartridges, I'm counting them as the same thing, so that I don't have to do every variation of Game Boy and DS. With the rules laid out, let's get started. Starting out with either of the two main categories, the easy thing to cite would be hardware limitations. Sprites and music on the NES could only be so complex, the game's so big, and two primary buttons, with a D-pad, really aren't a lot to work with. Plenty of people could hold this against the system, especially if they didn't grow up with it, so we could just leave it there, but I have one more complaint up my sleeve: the difficulty. While some might say that this was kinda the point, Nintendo hard and all that, it could sometimes be unreasonable and seem there merely to drag things out. Run out of time in the unintuitive castle maze in Super Mario Bros., game over, and start the whole thing over again. Make a graph paper map just to find your way in Zelda or Metroid. Try playing Castlevania at all. And all of this obscures just how long the games really were. Get the ins and outs down, or just play them today through something that lets you create save states or rewinds, and a lot of them turn out to be less than 2 hours long, which would probably feel like a real ripoff if some savant were able to clear it in one go after paying full MSRP. Artificially increasing playtime through artificial difficulty certainly might not seem like the best value prospect, and if any of these actually managed to make you cry as a kid, well, I could understand holding a grudge. The Super Nintendo is one I have a little bit of trouble with. Yes, bias might have something to do with it, it was my first console, but while you could make complaints about disliking pixels or beep boop soundtracks, I feel any real issues you might have here would go double for the NES, so how could this be your most despised? Thinking about it more though, this is the period I most associate with the console wars, or at least the Mario vs. Sonic phase of it. So maybe if you were a Sega diehard, I could see you viewing the SNES as public enemy number 1. Or, if I want to stretch things a little more, the Super Nintendo Mini was a highly scalped item, so if limited availability ruined a birthday, or you got raked over the coals for something that, in hindsight, wasn't worth it for you, that could do it too. Alright, I'm just gonna say it, I don't think early 3D aged well. In fact, I think games that go for realism rather than style in general tend to spoil, so I'm always weirded out when someone makes an indie game in the style of the N64 or its competitor. Maybe blocky horror was scary or polygonal boobs were hot back then, but these days, they do nothing for me. It's just not visually though, since they were also just figuring out how to make things like cameras and movements work in the third dimension, a lot of them are also pretty rough to play. Speaking of, its controller is also really weird. It's shaped like an elephant and looks like it's made for some freak with a third arm coming out of their chest. And I get it. Buttons for the right hand and grip either the other side or middle with your left, depending on whether the game calls for a D-pad or joystick, but it's still awkward. Sometimes I want a D-pad for something specific like a menu, but it doesn't work and most just stick with the joystick anyway, making the one arm largely superfluous. While it didn't take too long to figure out that you could have both inputs on the same side, one below the other, this was yet another way early 3D was a little weird. It also stuck with cartridges, right as everyone else was moving on to disc, which presented not only its own limitations, but meant that you could corrode your copies with your nasty spit when you tried to blow the dust out. Which didn't actually work, it was confirmation bias that we all bought into. If you said the GameCube, it's probably because you think it's overrated. And yeah, it's a console that didn't sell well, that I got bullied for owning, that everyone, at some point, retroactively decided was the peak of the medium. If we look at it another way though, we could say it was a system that didn't live up to its potential. It was a powerful piece of tech that didn't get the respect it should have because it was seen as the baby console, with more cartoony characters, so people flocked more to Xbox and PlayStation, where you could kill a man or watch your waifu get impaled. It was the first console that could hook up to the internet, yet I only know of one game that did so, though you needed a crazy attachment for it, and I've heard some call the controller tiny. Regardless, you could say that its failure, which was the last time Nintendo really seemed to be cutting edge, put them on a course that continues to this day. The Wii might be the most divisive console in history. It brought Nintendo back from the brink, was immensely popular, and regardless of your complaints, you probably still owned one. That's because it made gaming more casual, with its hardware gimmick motion control. For gatekeepers, that's horrible. For people wondering where the harder difficulty is in the latest entry in a long-running series, that's bad too, since it kinda seems like Nintendo started focusing on their newer audience rather than their established one. It's fine if you want to make a game easier for newer players, but still, difficulty options go both ways. As for the motion controls, hardware gimmicks aren't always the best. Once again, anyone wanting more traditional controls can get left out in the cold. If they get forced into a game, even when it doesn't make sense, and if they really go hard on it, it can be disastrous when they don't work. The system also took a hit to its power, which led to the trend of the Nintendo version of most games being the worst. Popularity comes with its own headaches, and suddenly you had everyone making their own motion control schlock, leading to a lot of bargain bin trash on the console. As for the Wiimotes themselves, you had to sync them up rather than plug them in, needed a steady supply of batteries, a bunch became outdated if you didn't upgrade them with the Wii Motion Plus attachment, which still didn't always solve the unresponsive problem, and there were a bunch of broken TVs early on before the strats became a bit thicker. So, yeah, take your pick on this one. The Wii U feels like low-hanging fruit, but it was a console with a dumb name that people couldn't figure out if it were a new system or just a peripheral for the old one. This led to further complications since nobody bought it, which meant that no one wanted to make games for it, especially because that would have meant that they would need to do something with the gamepad, which was horrible. It was a frickin' meme how weak this thing's battery life was, and given how many games required the thing to work, heck, you couldn't even load anything up without it, that meant that you always needed at least 3 outlets: TV, console, pad. At least when a regular controller was dying, you could plug it into the system. This is one of the few Nintendo consoles where it felt like there weren't many games for it, at least not until the later years. Not even I, a Nintendo diehard, picked this one up until they announced Smash. At first due to my own confusion, then because Pikmin 3 was literally the only thing I wanted to play. It also doesn't feel like it made good on its promise that you'd be able to swap to just the gamepad if someone else needed the TV. Sure, it worked with ports of old games you could get on the eShop, but most new titles required both screens, sometimes to your detriment because none of us have eyeballs in our nipples. Already talked about it a little bit with the Wii, and I'll do so more in depth later, but hardware gimmicks forced into games can really weigh things down. And, going back to it, if you were counting on the either-or screen thing to avoid fights over the TV, you might have felt lied to. Moving on to handhelds, we have Game Boy, Pocket, and Color. Maybe I should keep that last one separate, but hey, the carts just make the system name bubble convex rather than concave, and NSO groups them together. Plus, almost all my points apply to both, the one just has more than green and grayscale. Once again, you have the hardware limitations for visuals, sound, and size like on the NES, but jacked up to an 11. It'll also eat up your batteries unless you have a cord, and it isn't backlit, so you always need a spot in the sun to play it. And worst of all is the screen size. It's teeny tiny, so things on it need to be relatively big so that you know what you're looking at. This can lead to you having next to no reaction time, so unless you're playing something slower paced, you can get sucker punched by an enemy all-screen, or even something right in front of you if you're standing shoulder to shoulder and there's no wind-up on their attacks. It also received a lot of adaptation that there's really not a lot of need to play. Unless you're a fanatic, there's no real reason to recommend Mega Man Extreme when you could be playing X1 and 2, and why play Donkey Kong Land when Country is right there? Back then, you had them because that was your only choice. You couldn't take your home console with you to your brother's soccer game, you were a captive audience. So, I don't know, do you find Stockholm Syndrome romantic? The Game Boy Advance is another one that kinda fits in with the Super Nintendo. Sure, I could come up with some marks against it, but most of them are either just as bad or worse for its predecessor. I could still get ambushed in Mega Man Zero, but I at least have some wiggle room. I could still play F-Zero on the go, but I'd rather do so at home. Batteries could still be a problem, and it still had no backlight, at least until the SP. Its port faced the opposite way though, so I had to twist my worm light around if I wanted to use it, which felt like I was damaging it. Though going back to that SP thing, this does seem to be where Nintendo started getting a little silly with the different models. I mean, sure, the SP is fine. Backlight is good, and folding it to avoid scratching the screen when you throw it in your pocket is smart. But why make a GBA the size of a vanilla wafer? That's just stupid, even if I do kinda wish I had one. I also swear there was something off with its sound profile. It didn't happen with all the games, Battle Network was fine, but others like Pokemon sounded bleary. And I know it wasn't the composition because they sounded not painful but great when we got the Gen 3 remakes. In another case of broken promises, there was also that whole link cable, making it seem like you could use it as another controller for your GameCube. Which you could, but in very limited capacity, like for one player in Pac-Man Versus, to get extra stuff in Wind Waker, or in its most hellish implementation, 4 Swords flipping the script and making it the only way to play, meaning 4 Game Boy Advances with 4 cables on top of the system and disc if you wanted a full crew. Or maybe I just jumped to conclusions and this was obvious from the beginning, but it still feels like a bit of a betrayal, though maybe I should blame the GameCube just as much for this one. Maybe it's like when you walk in on your partner doing it with your best friend. Who you're angrier at depends on who you expect more loyalty from. Or in this case, who you're more willing to forgive. I've already complained about hardware gimmicks, and the DS was patient zero for those. Yeah, there were a few oddball attachments here and there beforehand, like the Mario Paint Mouse, Rumble Pack, and Hey You Pikachu mic, but the extra screen with touchpad and microphone were built right into the system, and every game needed to use them. Some pulled it off well, others seemed to not have anything too creative up their sleeve and would just use it for a map or something, making you question whether the second screen was even necessary, and still others ham-fisted the gimmick into games, making them painful to play, and I'm of the opinion that no game should literally hurt you. All of this also raises the issue that it's kind of hard to port games that require 2 screens. Of course, it depends on the implementation. The why bothers might not be too much trouble, but anything that really relied on the gimmick is going to be a problem. There were some DS games available on the Wii U, though that there were several different layouts available kinda feels like an admission that there really ain't a perfect solution, and it's up to you to decide what kind of concessions you're willing to make. While there have been a few DS remakes and ports elsewhere, they're definitely pretty rare compared to just about every other console. And while we discussed the different handheld models before, the DS stands out to me as when they were really the most prevalent. Every year or two, we get a slight upgrade and have to question whether it was worth shelling out again for. It all felt very excessive. Plus, due to the touchscreen, each came with a stylus, which was an extra piece of plastic you had to keep track of. For the 3DS, keep all the complaints I just mentioned, and add in a new one. When a feature is thrown in, even if you don't use it, you still end up paying for it. And I'm obviously talking about the 3D here. I turned on the 3D very rarely, and then, mostly because I felt obligated to use it since it was the system's big selling point. And talking to a lot of other people, I've heard similar stories. But hey, Nintendo still needed to develop the tech and include it into every system they put out. That factors into price, so much so that the system was too rich for most people's taste and they had to do a major price drop a few months after launch. If you paid the previous higher price, you were compensated through the Ambassadors program, letting you download a bunch of games for free. Though they were all ports of older titles and you didn't get a choice between that and a partial refund, so if you didn't want those, maybe because you were such a huge Nintendo fan that you still had all those old titles on old systems, You know, the type of person into Nintendo enough that they would buy a super expensive console at launch, then you might still wind up feeling hosed. And if you want to say that Nintendo did eventually put out a 2DS, well, yeah, but not only was this the sort of thing that wasn't really talked about up front so that you'd have no idea you could have just waited, it was also a wide hunk of plastic that you'd likely have a hard time fitting into your pocket, which is kinda something you want for a handheld. Or did they eventually do a foldable 2DS? You see, I don't know, because good lord, I think this system might have had the most iterations of the lot. Some of these also tacked on the prefix new, which always ages well. Even if you're fine with all that though, you were okay with what you paid, and you could take or leave the 3D, I'd still say you were affected. Most games had at least some 3D functionality, which needed to be programmed in. Even if we assume that Nintendo fixed prices to what people were willing to pay without thought to the extra development cost, the time spent programming in 3D could have been used on something else. Or, if the devs managed to fit in everything they wanted, even with that extra strain, maybe the game could have been released earlier. So to repeat, whether you ever flicked that 3D slider, whether it was ever on for you or not, you still wound up paying for it. This, though, is the actual correct answer, the Virtual Boy, which I bet a good number of people forgot about or possibly never even heard of. First off, it was a little too ambitious. Nintendo already had home and handheld consoles, yet they wanted a third avenue, 3D. It had a limited color palette, just red and black, and you needed to stick your face up against the headset. This looked kind of weird, especially since there's no peeking over your shoulder with something like this, so people would have no idea what you were up to. If you did want to share, hopefully anyone else using the console didn't have a sweaty brow. And you may have noticed that when I talked about the 3DS, I didn't mention headaches. Well, that's because the filter was optional, adjustable, much more refined, you were able to keep the system at whatever distance you were comfortable with, and while some might experience pain with enough use, it was never required and you could always stop before it got too bad. Not so here though, you needed to lock in, and it hurt. When I first played it, long after the fact, and as an adult with a fully developed brain, I got a severe headache after just under an hour. Then, after taking a sizable break, it took around 30 minutes for it to happen again. And to go back to what I said earlier, a game should not literally hurt to play. In addition to that, because the system never caught on, golly gee, wonder why, it never got too many games, leaving it with a pretty piddly library, which is another mark against it. No wonder it was so forgettable. Okay, I'll admit, when I heard some people saying the Switch, I kinda thought they were being contrarians. It might be the most popular console of all time, vying with the PS2 for best selling, and that had its built-in DVD player really working in its favor. And the Switch is the most popular console on the market currently, by far, unless we maybe count PC. Saying that you hate the thing everyone else loves earned you some real cool guy points. So yeah, I could see picking it as the worst just for that. Then I actually thought about it, and that might have been too hasty a judgment. A lot of things I previously mentioned crop up here too. For bad controllers, we have Joy-Con drift, so egregious that there have been lawsuits. Shortages giving rise to scalpers, drawing in a more casual audience while neglecting the more hardcore, a ton of cruddy, cheaply made games crowding the eShop, eclipsing the real gems in many cases, and even being borderline pornographic, as if we don't have Steam for the full Monty. While I haven't brought up online much, Nintendo's never really been stellar with that, and now we get to pay for it. There's a ton of ports that seem like they should be cheaper given what's on offer. And for gimmicks we didn't ask for, we have HD Rumble, which I bet no one remembers yet probably hikes up Joy-Con prices, the things you'll be finding yourself replacing a lot. And also its hybrid nature. While you can get a handheld only one, there are some games you can't play that way, and there's no option for a TV only version other than just never undocking it. And the cost is more than just the price tag, it affects what games you get too. In previous generations, you could be a Nintendo loyalist and still watch Sony and Microsoft presentations, since there could still be announcements for multi-platform titles. Not so much here though. Even during the Wii era, it was still profitable enough that you just get a subpar version of a lot of games, but maybe the tech gap is too big now. If a game winds up coming to Switch, a lot of times, it's far after the fact and really dumbed down. Even if you're the type to not care about graphics or frame rates, you gotta admit, less games still hurt. The Switch also has had one of the longest console generations, maybe the longest, going on 8 years, meaning it was behind the times when it launched in 2017, and we've just been dealing with it. While maybe the Switch 2 will bring things up to speed, it'll probably be more of the same, meaning the original success has locked us into another who knows how many years. So yeah, regardless of what the numbers say, there's definitely plenty to complain about. While I think I made this clear from the beginning, I was mostly playing devil's advocate with this one. If you happen to type an angry comment because I was too convincing and you missed the subtext, I hope you feel silly. Assuming you haven't already left by this point. Huh. While I think a lot of these are complaints you could make, I find most of them ignorable, outweighed by the positives, or just downright petty, so I wouldn't condemn any of these. Well, outside of the Virtual Boy. I also struggled to come up with reasons for a few of them, so why don't I ask you? What do you think the worst Nintendo console is, why, and were there any flaws I failed to mention? Also, please don't sass me for not mentioning Game & Watch or any other oddballs that I ignored. With that, thanks as always for watching, and maybe consider subscribing if you're into retro games, especially platformers. Oh, and as for what I actually think about each of these consoles, I'll do a video ranking them if you all watch this one 20 times. Not 20 views, you all have to watch it 20 times each.